Okay, today we're going to talk about the basic parts of the guitar and also discuss the three types of guitars that are most commonly found in the U.S. at least, because around the world there's lots of varieties. This particular type is called a classical guitar, and the notable features are, the most obvious ones at least, are the strings. They're made out of nylon, and the width of the neck, this portion here, is wider than the other two types that we'll look at today. Of all three guitars that we're going to look at, the classical guitar is the oldest, but is a relatively new instrument. It was invented around 1865 in Spain, at least this particular design. Before that, guitars were a lot smaller and quieter. The other two types of guitars, the steel string acoustic guitar and the electric guitar, are newer instruments, and they were invented in the U.S. So in this classical guitar, we're going to look at the different parts. If we look at the top of the instrument, this part here is called the headstock. In fact, it's easy to think of the whole instrument as a human figure, this being the head. So headstock, on the headstock we have the tuning machines. Notice there's 6 of them, one for each of the strings. The next important part is this piece here. That is called the nut. And we will be referring to that in order to orient this way or that way. So it's important to remember this. On cheaper instruments, this is made out of plastic. On finer instruments, it's some type of organic material like bone. This piece here, as I mentioned, is the neck. And on the neck, here we have these spaces separated by fret wire. The spaces are called frets. This is the first fret, then the second, third, fourth, etc. As we move up, we get to the body of the instrument, or down, I should say. We get to the body of the instrument. This is the sound hole. The decorative part around the sound hole is called the rosette. And then finally down here, on top of the face of the guitar, we have the bridge. Now, classical guitars are distinctive because you have to tie the strings on, as opposed to the other two systems, which we'll look at. Inside of the bridge, we have another piece of either plastic on cheaper instruments or bone on finer instruments that sits in the bridge. That is called the saddle. So if you think about it, the string is held on one end by the nut and on the other by the saddle. The saddle is really important because the string's tension pushes down on the saddle, which then pushes down on the top of the guitar. The top of the guitar is sometimes also called the face of the guitar. Now, other parts you should know about are obvious. We have the back, the sides. This part here is important on a classical guitar. It's called the heel. So now I'm going to look at the next variety, which is called the steel string acoustic guitar. This is a steel string acoustic guitar. As I mentioned before, these were invented in the U.S. This particular guitar is made by the same company, by the gentleman that basically invented steel string guitars in the U.S. His name was Christoph Friedrich Martin. He was a German immigrant. He started in New York and then moved to Pennsylvania. Anyways, the distinctive features of this, it's very, very similar to a classical guitar. Notice it has the headstock and the tuners, although the setup's slightly different. It's got the nut. It's got the fingerboard, the fretboard with the frets and the fret wire. One difference is you'll notice that there's markers on the fretboard. And those are placed in very specific spots, usually at fret number 3, 5, 7, 9, 12. And there's variety on that depending on who the manufacturer of the guitar is. Another distinctive feature of a steel string acoustic guitar, of course, is the obvious one, which is the strings are made out of steel rather than nylon. This piece here is called a pick guard, and it basically just serves to protect the top from strumming. Steel string acoustic guitars tend to be strummed, although they can also be finger picked, right? A strum, or I can finger pick it. So they're played both ways. There's one difference in the bridge, and that is how the strings are held in. These are actually pins that hold the string in place. They are inserted into a hole in the bridge that drops through the top of the guitar. There's other differences that are not obvious because they're internal. These guitars tend to be constructed more heavily than classical guitars because there's more tension produced by the metal strings on the face of the guitar. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. These guitars are oversized. There's many different sizes of acoustic steel string guitars. There's really only one general type of classical guitar, body shape. There's many sizes and body shapes of steel string acoustic guitars. This particular one is called a Dreadnought. It was named after a ship in the 19th century. Some people, you'll notice, will hold this guitar like that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the sitting position here in a minute. So the final type of instrument is an electric guitar. And there's two varieties of electric guitars. This is a solid body electric guitar, and there's also other guitars that are hollow inside, and there's some that are actually semi-hollow. Later on, we'll discuss those details in more detail. Okay, so if you look at the basic instrument, most of the parts are the same. You have the headstock, the tuner, the nut, the fingerboard, the frets. On electric guitars, we usually have the markers as well. The biggest difference is in the weight of the instrument, right? And then also, electric guitars need electronics, and you need an amplifier to be able to hear them. They're very quiet otherwise. Electric guitars tend to be played with a pick, but they can also be played finger picking. For this class, any three varieties of the instruments will do just fine. So these parts here are called pickups, and they work on the principle of electromagnetism. Because these strings are made out of metal, they actually disturb the magnetic field, which is then converted into electricity, and we get sound. These control, the knobs here control the pickups, and there's also a switch selector. Another important difference in the electric guitar is the type of bridge used. These are actually called saddles. Each individual string has a movable saddle. And the saddle can be adjusted up or down for playability to make the strings closer or farther away from the fretboard. And they can also be adjusted front and back to tune the string finely. Another feature of electric guitars, by the way, I did not mention, these were invented about 1950. 1953, 1952 was the first year that solid body electric guitars were mass produced. They were invented, as I said, in the US. The technology started before that, and they actually came from Hawaiian lap steel guitars that were played in the lap like that. These guitars also have, the bridge is what we call a floating bridge, because you could actually move the bridge so that the strings bend like this. This bar here is called a tremolo bar or a whammy bar. So those are the three basic types of guitars: classical guitar, steel string acoustic, and the electric guitar.